218 BCE. The Via Aurelia, Rome's strategic highway hugging the Tyrrhenian coast. Consul Gaius Atilius Regulus stood in his command tent studying reports that made no sense. His scouts described weapons that violated everything Romans understood about warfare. Swords longer than a man's arm, designed for slashing rather than stabbing, wielded by warriors who fought naked and screaming. The descriptions seemed like fever dreams, exaggerations born from fear. Within days, he would discover they were horrifying understatements. The Battle of Telamon in 225 BCE would become one of the most decisive engagements in early Roman history, but its significance extended far beyond military victory. It marked Rome's first major encounter with Celtic longswords, weapons so fundamentally different from Roman gladi that they would force a complete reimagining of Roman infantry tactics, armour design, and battlefield doctrine. The psychological impact of facing these massive slashing weapons would haunt Roman military thinking for generations. The Gauls called them spatha. To the Romans, who had never seen anything like them, they were simply terrifying. 3 feet of pattern-welded iron designed to cleave rather than pierce, swung with both hands by warriors whose entire martial culture revolved around the devastating power of the overhead slash. These weapons represented a completely different philosophy of combat, one that prioritized reach, momentum, and raw kinetic energy over the controlled thrusting techniques that dominated Mediterranean warfare. To understand the shock Romans experienced at Telamon, we must first understand how radically different Celtic and Roman approaches to sword combat actually were. The Roman gladius, the iconic short sword that would eventually conquer the known world, was a weapon of discipline and formation fighting. Roughly 18 to 24 inches long, the gladius was designed for stabbing attacks delivered from behind the protection of a scutum shield. Roman infantry fought shoulder to shoulder in tight formations where there was no room for wild slashing. The gladius was a tool of surgical precision, designed to find gaps in enemy defences and deliver fatal thrusts to the torso. Celtic longswords represented the exact opposite philosophy. Measuring between 28 and 35 inches, some examples reaching nearly 40 inches, these weapons were designed for devastating slashing attacks that could dismember, decapitate, or cleave through shields and armour. They were wielded with both hands, or with one hand from horseback, generating massive kinetic energy through wide, sweeping arcs. Where the gladius was a scalpel, the Celtic longsword was a sledgehammer wrapped in an edge. The metallurgy of Celtic swords was sophisticated beyond what Romans initially understood. Celtic smiths had mastered pattern welding, a technique where strips of iron with different carbon contents were twisted together, forge-welded and hammered into blade shape. This created a blade with a hard edge capable of holding sharpness and a flexible spine that could absorb impact without shattering. The distinctive wavy patterns visible on the blade surface weren't just decorative. They were proof of construction technique that produced weapons far superior to simple iron bars sharpened to an edge. The best Celtic blades, produced by master smiths whose skills were passed down through generations, could maintain an edge through extended combat while remaining flexible enough to bend rather than break when striking armour or shields. Roman accounts from later campaigns describe Celtic swords bending during combat, requiring warriors to straighten them with their feet before continuing to fight. This wasn't a defect, it was actually a feature. A blade that bent rather than shattered could be straightened and used again. A broken blade was worthless. But at Telamon in 225 BCE, Roman soldiers weren't analysing metallurgical techniques. They were trying to survive the most terrifying weapons they had ever faced. The strategic situation that led to Telamon had been building for decades. Gallic tribes had been raiding Roman territory since Rome's earliest days, but the Gallic invasion of 225 BCE was different. This wasn't a raid. It was a coordinated invasion by multiple Celtic tribes, the Boii, the Insubres, and the Gesatai, a mercenary warrior society from beyond the Alps whose very name meant spearmen, but who were actually renowned for their skill with longswords. The Gauls had assembled an army of approximately 50,000 warriors, including 20,000 infantry and substantial cavalry forces. They had crossed the Apennines and were moving down the Italian peninsula, pillaging and burning as they went. Roman historians claim the Gauls were seeking to avenge their defeat at the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE, where a Gallic coalition had been destroyed by Roman legions. Whether revenge or simple plunder motivated them, the result was the largest Gallic invasion of Roman territory in living memory. Rome's response was unprecedented. They mobilized 8 legions plus allied forces, a total force of approximately 150,000 men. This represented nearly the entire military capacity of the Roman Republic. Stripped from every garrison and defensive position, the stakes were existential. If the Gauls weren't stopped, Rome itself would be threatened. The Roman command structure at Telamon involved 2 consular armies. Consul Gaius Atilius Regulus approached from the north, moving down the Via Aurelia to intercept the Gallic retreat. Consul Lucius Aemilius Pappus approached from the south, pursuing the Gauls after they had turned back from their advance toward Rome. The Gauls found themselves caught between 2 Roman armies near Telamon, modern-day Talamone on the Tuscan coast, with the sea at their backs. The Gallic commanders, Concolatenus and Aneroestes, recognized their predicament immediately. They were trapped between 2 superior Roman forces with limited room to maneuver. Their response was to form a double-fronted line, facing threats from both north and south simultaneously. They placed their most experienced warriors, the Insubres and Boii, on the front lines of both formations. Behind them, they positioned the Gaecitae, the elite mercenary warriors from beyond the Alps. The Gaecitae were about to introduce Roman soldiers to an aspect of Celtic warfare that would become legendary in Roman military literature. They fought naked, completely naked except for torques, arm rings, and war paint. Roman sources struggled to explain this practice, speculating it was related to religious beliefs or simple barbarian madness. The reality was more practical. Celtic warriors believed that dying with wounds in your back, wounds that could only be received while fleeing, brought eternal shame. Fighting naked meant you couldn't be suspected of hiding such wounds. It was a statement of absolute commitment to face the enemy or die trying. But naked warriors carrying 3-foot longswords weren't just making symbolic statements. They were optimized for a specific combat style that Roman formations had never encountered. Without armor, the Gaecitae could move with shocking speed, generating maximum momentum for their slashing attacks. The longsword's reach advantage, approximately 12 to 18 inches longer than a gladius, meant they could strike Roman shields and helmets before Roman swords could reach them. The initial Roman response to seeing thousands of naked warriors screaming war cries and wielding massive swords was near panic. Polybius, the Greek historian who interviewed veterans of Telamon, described the psychological impact explicitly. The sight of the Gaecitae in the front ranks, naked and carrying their longswords, created terror among the Romans who had never seen anything like it. The noise alone was overwhelming. Gallic warriors beating swords against shields, screaming challenges and blowing Carnix war horns that produced sounds unlike anything in the Mediterranean world. When the lines met, Roman soldiers discovered that all their training and discipline had not prepared them for Celtic longswords. The first overhead slash that crashed into a Roman scutum shield wasn't just blocked, it was obliterating. The kinetic energy transferred through the shield into the bearer's arm was enough to numb limbs or break bones. Shields that blocked gladius thrusts reliably could be split by a powerfully swung longsword. Roman soldiers found themselves fighting defensively, trying to avoid rather than block the devastating overhead strikes. The gladius, optimized for thrusting attacks at close quarters, was nearly useless at the ranges where longswords operated. A Roman soldier trying to close for a killing thrust had to first survive crossing the killing zone where Celtic warriors could deliver multiple slashing attacks. The mathematical disadvantage was brutal. A longsword with a 35-inch blade wielded by a warrior with a 30-inch reach advantage meant Roman soldiers faced incoming attacks from approximately 5 feet away, while their own 22-inch gladius required them to be within 3 feet to strike effectively. The initial Roman casualties at Telamon were catastrophic. Entire front ranks were cut down in the first minutes of combat. Polybius described Roman soldiers having their shield arms severed, helmets split in two, and shoulders cleaved to the spine. These weren't the clean puncture wounds Roman military surgeons knew how to treat. These were massive traumatic injuries that resulted in near-instant death or permanent disability. Celtic warriors targeted specific areas with their longsword strikes. The head, obviously, was a prime target. Roman helmets of the period, the Montefortino-type bronze helmets common in the 3rd century BCE, offered limited protection against overhead slashing attacks. The relatively thin bronze could be dented or even penetrated by a powerful longsword strike. Warriors who survived direct head strikes often suffered concussions, skull fractures, or death from the kinetic energy transfer alone. The shoulders and collarbone represented another primary target. A downward slash aimed at the junction of neck and shoulder, even if partially blocked by a shield, could break the collarbone or sever the muscles and tendons connecting the arm to the torso. Roman soldiers who suffered such wounds were instantly combat ineffective, unable to hold shields or weapons. The shield arm itself was a constant target. Celtic warriors understood that destroying a Roman soldier's shield eliminated his primary defence and left him vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Longsword slashes aimed at the top edge of the scutum could split the layered wood construction or force the bearer to lower his shield, exposing his head and torso. But Roman soldiers at Telamon discovered something crucial that would eventually lead to tactical adaptations. Celtic longswords, for all their terrifying power, had a significant vulnerability. They required space. A warrior swinging a 35-inch blade in a full overhead or horizontal slash needed approximately 6 feet of lateral space to generate maximum power. In dense formations where warriors were packed close together, longswords couldn't be used effectively. The Roman response, developed through desperate necessity in the midst of battle, was to close distance immediately after Celtic warriors delivered their initial strikes. The longsword, once swung, required a recovery period to return to ready position. In that brief window, perhaps half a second to a full second, depending on the warrior's strength and technique, Roman soldiers could rush forward, crash their shields into Celtic warriors, and deliver gladius thrusts at close quarters where the longsword's reach advantage became a liability. This tactic, shield rush followed by close quarters stabbing, would eventually become standard Roman doctrine against Celtic opponents, but at Telamon in 225 BCE, it was improvised desperately by soldiers watching their comrades cut down and realizing that maintaining distance meant death. The battle raged for hours. The Gallic double-fronted line fought with savage determination, knowing retreat was impossible with the sea at their backs. The Gaceti, fighting naked in the front ranks, took horrific casualties but inflicted equally terrible losses on Roman forces. Polybius estimated that 40,000 Gauls were killed at Telamon, with 10,000 captured. Roman casualties, though not precisely recorded, were substantial. Consul Gaius Atilius Regulus was killed in the fighting, struck down while leading his forces against the northern Gallic line. The eventual Roman victory at Telamon came not from superior swordsmanship or better weapons, but from numbers, discipline, and the tactical advantage of attacking from 2 directions simultaneously. The Gauls, despite their fearsome weapons and warrior culture, couldn't maintain cohesion while defending against 2 separate Roman armies. As their formation broke down and warriors became separated, the longsword's advantages disappeared. In confused melees where formation integrity was lost, the shorter, more maneuverable gladius became more effective, but the psychological impact of facing Celtic longswords would persist long after the tactical crisis at Telamon was resolved. Roman soldiers who survived the battle carried physical and mental scars that influenced Roman military development for generations. The immediate aftermath of Telamon saw Roman military authorities conducting detailed analysis of the battle. This wasn't typical practice for ancient warfare, but the shock of facing completely unexpected weapons and tactics forced Roman commanders to ask hard questions. Why had their soldiers taken such terrible casualties? What could be done to prevent similar disasters in future Celtic conflicts? The answers led to the first major evolution of Roman military equipment in decades. Roman armourers studying damaged helmets from Telamon realised that Montefortino-type bronze helmets offered inadequate protection against overhead slashing attacks. The relatively smooth dome shape, effective at deflecting gladius thrusts or glancing blows, could not prevent the massive kinetic energy of a longsword strike from being transferred to the wearer's skull. The response was the development of the Culus helmet, named after the French town where examples were later discovered. Culus helmets featured thicker bronze construction, a deeper bowl shape to provide more standoff distance from the skull, and most importantly, reinforcing ridges that helped distribute impact energy. Later developments added brass or iron reinforcement strips running front to back over the crown, creating zones of enhanced protection exactly where longsword strikes were most likely to land. Roman shield design also evolved in response to Telamon. The scutum shield, already the largest and most protective shield in the ancient world, was reinforced with additional iron or bronze edge banding. This banding, fitted around the shield's perimeter, prevented longsword slashes from splitting the layered wood construction. Some units began using shields with iron bosses large enough to deflect or catch incoming longsword strikes, turning the shield from purely passive defense to an active tool for controlling Celtic weapons. Body armor saw similar evolution. The pectorale, a square bronze breastplate worn by wealthier Roman soldiers, was enlarged and reinforced. Mail armor, lorica hamata, already known in the Mediterranean world, became standard issue for front-rank troops who would face Celtic opponents. Mail's flexibility allowed it to deform and absorb the kinetic energy of slashing attacks that would simply transfer through rigid plate armor to the body beneath. But equipment changes alone couldn't solve the tactical problem posed by Celtic longswords. Roman military trainers had to develop new techniques specifically for fighting against slashing weapons wielded by opponents with significant reach advantages. The training reforms instituted after Telamon focused on 3 key principles. First, maintain shield discipline at all costs. Roman soldiers were drilled endlessly in keeping their shields high and centered, protecting the head and torso even when natural instinct was to lower the shield to see approaching threats. Second, close distance immediately after the enemy's initial strike. Trainers used wooden longswords to teach Roman recruits to recognize the recovery period after a slash and exploit that window to rush forward. Third, target the enemy's weapon arm. A gladius thrust to a Celtic warrior's extended sword arm would disable their ability to wield their primary weapon. These techniques were practiced using wooden weapons against trainers who deliberately used longsword-style attacks. Roman military training, already sophisticated by ancient standards, became even more comprehensive. Recruits spent weeks learning to fight specifically against Celtic warriors, studying their techniques, their preferred targets, and their vulnerabilities. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Telamon's lessons emphasized formation, integrity above all else. Roman commanders realized that Celtic longswords were most dangerous when warriors had room to swing freely. The response was to make Roman formations even more compact than before, shield to shield with minimal gaps. This tight spacing prevented Celtic warriors from generating full power with their swings, while allowing Roman soldiers to deliver short, controlled gladius thrusts through any gap in enemy defences. The evolution of Roman tactics also incorporated specific responses to naked Celtic warriors. Roman soldiers were trained to target the legs and abdomen of unarmoured opponents, areas difficult to protect with shields and extremely vulnerable to stabbing attacks. Against armoured Celts, Romans were taught to target joints, gaps in armour, and to use their shields as battering weapons to knock opponents off balance before delivering killing thrusts. But perhaps the most significant impact of Telamon was psychological. The battle demonstrated that Roman military supremacy wasn't inevitable, that Rome could face opponents with weapons and tactics so different from their own that all their training and experience might prove inadequate. This realization, traumatic as it was, forced Rome to become adaptable in ways their enemies were not. Celtic warfare, for all its effectiveness, remained largely unchanged over centuries. Warriors were trained in traditional techniques passed down through generations. The longsword remained the weapon of choice because it had always been the weapon of choice. Celtic military culture valued individual prowess and traditional methods over systematic innovation. Rome, by contrast, treated warfare as a science, requiring constant study and improvement. The shock of Telamon became a catalyst for military evolution. Every engagement with Celtic tribes produced after-action analysis. Every captured longsword was studied by Roman smiths. Every Celtic warrior who could be interrogated was questioned about training methods, combat techniques, and weapon maintenance. The Roman capacity for systematic learning and adaptation would eventually prove more valuable than any individual weapon or tactic. But in the immediate aftermath of Telamon, Roman soldiers simply tried to process what they had experienced and survived. Veterans of Telamon spoke of the battle in hushed tones for the rest of their lives. They described the sound of longswords cutting through air, a distinctive whistling hiss that signalled incoming death. They remembered the wet thud of blades striking shields, the crack of breaking bones, the screams of wounded comrades with severed limbs or cloven skulls. These weren't the clean combat wounds of gladius warfare. These were injuries that haunted witnesses. Roman military hospitals after Telamon treated wounds their surgeons had never seen before, massive traumatic amputations where entire limbs had been severed by single sword strikes, skull fractures so severe that brain matter was visible, shoulders split deeply enough to expose ribs and organs. The survival rate for such wounds was effectively zero with ancient medical knowledge. Most victims died within hours from blood loss or shock. The psychological impact on surviving soldiers manifested in various ways. Some developed what modern medicine would recognize as combat-related PTSD, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and involuntary physical reactions to sounds or sights that reminded them of the battle. Roman military authorities, lacking modern psychiatric understanding, attributed these reactions to cowardice or weak character. Men who showed such symptoms were often discharged in disgrace. But the broader Roman military establishment took the lessons of Telamon seriously. The Senate authorized unprecedented funding for military reforms. Equipment upgrades that would normally take decades to implement across all legions were rushed into production. Training methods were standardized to incorporate anti-Celtic tactics. Units that would serve in Gaul received additional specialized training. The metallurgical study of captured Celtic longswords produced revelations about ironworking techniques that Romans had not mastered. The pattern welding that created such effective blades was a Celtic innovation that Roman smiths struggled to replicate. It would take Roman metalworkers decades to fully understand and reproduce the technique. This acknowledgement that barbarian Celts possessed superior metallurgical knowledge was humbling for Roman pride but valuable for Roman military development. Captured longswords were sent to Rome's arsenals where they were studied, measured, and reverse-engineered. Roman smiths produced copies, trying to understand the relationship between blade geometry, weight distribution, and cutting performance. These experiments eventually influenced Roman sword design, though the gladius would remain the primary Roman infantry weapon. The spatha, a longer Roman cavalry sword developed in later centuries, showed clear Celtic influence in its design and usage. The political impact of Telamon was equally significant. The battle demonstrated that Gallic tribes, if unified, represented an existential threat to Rome. The casualty count, 40,000 Gallic dead, was staggering by ancient standards, but the fact that Gauls had assembled such a force at all was alarming. Roman strategic planning shifted to prioritize the complete conquest and subjugation of Cisalpine Gaul, the Celtic territories in northern Italy. The campaigns that followed Telamon over the next several decades represented Rome's first systematic attempt at territorial conquest and occupation, rather than simple defensive warfare. Roman generals applied lessons learned at terrible cost, using superior numbers, discipline, and increasingly effective anti-Celtic tactics to gradually reduce Gallic territories. But the memory of those first encounters with Celtic longswords never faded. Consul Lucius Aemilius Pappus, who survived Telamon and helped secure victory, later wrote extensively about the battle. His accounts, preserved in fragments by later historians, emphasized the shock of facing weapons that rendered traditional Roman tactics obsolete. He described the first moments of combat as near disaster, with Roman soldiers breaking ranks in fear as they watched their comrades cut down by weapons that seemed unstoppable. Pappus credited discipline and numbers for eventual Roman victory, but he acknowledged that weapon for weapon, warrior for warrior, Celtic longswords and the men who wielded them were superior to Roman forces in open combat. Only by exploiting the longsword's need for space, by forcing close-quarters combat where gladi were effective, and by accepting horrific casualties to close distance, did Roman soldiers survive long enough to win. The cultural impact of Telamon extended beyond military circles. Roman literature and art began depicting Gallic warriors with their distinctive longswords, often emphasizing the weapon's size and the barbarian ferocity of their wielders. These depictions served both as propaganda, showing Rome's victory over terrifying enemies, and as cultural processing of genuine trauma that the battle had inflicted on Roman consciousness. The Latin language gained new words and phrases related to Celtic weapons. Gladius longus, longsword, entered military vocabulary specifically to describe Celtic weapons. Roman orators used the phrase like a metaphorical threat, referring to political opponents facing disaster as facing the longsword of the Gauls. The religious response to Telamon was also significant. Rome held multiple days of thanksgiving ceremonies after the victory, offering sacrifices to Mars and Jupiter for delivering Rome from destruction. But private religious practices revealed more authentic reactions. Archaeological evidence shows a spike in protective amulets and religious dedication after 225 BCE, suggesting widespread anxiety about future Celtic threats. The economic impact of Telamon manifested in several ways. The weapons and armour upgrades mandated after the battle required substantial state investment. Roman military equipment production, already a significant industry, expanded dramatically. New arsenals were established, existing facilities were enlarged, and production techniques were refined to increase output while maintaining quality. The study of Celtic metallurgy eventually led to improved Roman ironworking techniques. While Romans never fully adopted pattern welding for military production, too labour-intensive and requiring too much skilled craftsmanship for mass production, they did develop improved methods for producing consistently high-quality iron. This technological transfer from barbarian Celts to civilized Romans was rarely acknowledged publicly, but was real and significant. Trade relationships with Celtic tribes also changed after Telamon. Roman merchants, now aware of Celtic metallurgical skill, sought to establish trade networks for Celtic-produced iron goods. This economic integration, combined with military pressure, would eventually prove more effective at subduing Celtic tribes than pure military force. The generational impact of Telamon became evident decades later during Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Roman soldiers who fought in Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE were descendants of Telamon veterans. The tactical doctrines, equipment, and training they received all reflected lessons learned in 225 BCE. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars repeatedly reference Celtic longswords and the tactics required to counter them, showing that 175 years after Telamon, Celtic weapons still demanded respect and specific countermeasures. Caesar himself faced Celtic longswords in personal combat at least once. During a battle in 57 BCE, Caesar's personal guard was overwhelmed, and he found himself fighting hand-to-hand with Gallic warriors. His survival, armed with gladius against longsword, demonstrated both personal skill and the effectiveness of Roman training methods developed after Telamon. But Caesar was honest enough in his commentaries to note that survival against Celtic longswords required significant advantages in armour, training, or numbers. The archaeological record of Telamon and subsequent Roman-Celtic conflicts provides physical evidence of the violence these weapons inflicted. Mass graves from Celtic-Roman battlefields contain human remains, showing the characteristic injuries of longsword combat. Skulls split vertically or horizontally, severed limbs with clean cuts through bone, vertebrae severed by single strikes. Forensic analysis of these remains confirms the devastating effectiveness of Celtic slashing weapons against human targets. Equally telling are the damaged Roman shields and helmets recovered from battle sites. Shields showing deep cuts from longsword strikes, sometimes penetrating completely through multiple layers of wood and leather. Helmets with massive dents or cuts, some showing evidence of having been struck with enough force to kill the wearer despite the helmet absorbing much of the impact. The longsword's effectiveness wasn't just theoretical or literary exaggeration. Physical evidence confirms that these weapons could inflict the traumatic injuries described in ancient sources. Modern experimental archaeology, where replica longswords are tested against replica Roman equipment, demonstrates that proper longsword strikes could indeed split shields, dent helmets, and deliver incapacitating injuries even to armoured opponents. But these same experiments also validate Roman tactical adaptations. Close-quarters combat, the shield rush developed after Telamon, significantly reduces longsword effectiveness. At distances under 3 feet, the gladius becomes superior. The archaeological record shows this too. Remains from later Roman-Celtic conflicts, after Roman tactical adaptations were fully implemented, show fewer traumatic slashing injuries and more puncture wounds from gladius thrusts. The ultimate fate of Celtic longswords in European warfare provides a final perspective on their impact. As Rome conquered Celtic territories and integrated Celtic populations into the empire, the longsword gradually disappeared from military use. Roman equipment standardization, combined with Roman tactical doctrine emphasizing formation fighting, made longswords increasingly irrelevant. Celtic smiths who once forged pattern-welded longswords began producing Roman-style weapons instead. But the longsword's design and concept didn't die completely. The Spatha, Rome's cavalry sword developed in the 1st century CE, was essentially a Roman interpretation of the Celtic longsword. Measuring 30 to 40 inches, used primarily for slashing from horseback, The spatha represented Rome's acknowledgement that for certain applications the Celtic approach to sword design was superior. In the centuries after Rome's fall, European sword design would return repeatedly to the principles demonstrated by Celtic longswords. Medieval longswords, Viking swords, and ultimately the military sabres of early modern Europe all shared the Celtic emphasis on reach, cutting power, and versatility. The gladius design, so effective for Roman infantry, would largely disappear. The longsword concept would endure. At Telamon in 225 BCE, Roman soldiers experienced shock and terror facing weapons they didn't understand and couldn't initially counter. Their initial reaction, near panic, was entirely rational given the circumstances, but the Roman response, systematic analysis followed by tactical and technological adaptation, transformed initial defeat into eventual military supremacy. The Celtic longsword at Telamon represented the high point of Celtic military effectiveness. Never again would Celtic warriors enjoy such technological and tactical advantages over Roman forces. Rome learned, adapted, and ultimately overcame. But the cost of that education was measured in thousands of Roman lives and a cultural trauma that would influence Roman military thinking for centuries. When Roman soldiers first faced Celtic longswords at Telamon, they faced a weapon system optimized by centuries of Celtic warfare, wielded by warriors trained from childhood in its use, backed by metallurgical techniques Rome didn't fully understand. The shock wasn't just tactical or technological. It was the shock of discovering that Rome's military supremacy, assumed to be natural and inevitable, was actually contingent and vulnerable. The legacy of Telamon lived on in Roman military culture as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating enemies and the necessity of continuous adaptation. Roman training incorporated the lessons learned. Roman equipment evolved to counter the threats discovered. Roman tactics developed specifically to neutralize the advantages Celtic longswords provided. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural. Rome learned at Telamon that military superiority required humility, the willingness to study enemies, learn from defeats, and adopt even barbarian innovations if they proved effective. This capacity for adaptation, born from the trauma of facing Celtic longswords, would ultimately prove more valuable than any weapon or tactic. The Celtic longsword shocked Roman soldiers at their first encounter at Telamon, but the shock forced evolution, and that evolution transformed Rome from a regional Italian power into the dominant military force in the ancient world. The weapons that nearly broke Roman lines in 225 BCE became the catalyst for Rome's rise to supremacy. In the end, Rome didn't defeat the Celtic longsword. Rome learned from it, adapted to it, and ultimately absorbed its lessons into a military system that would dominate the known world for 5 centuries. The battlefield at Telamon left physical evidence that archaeologists would uncover millennia later, but the immediate impact was felt in the Roman military establishment's unprecedented response to a tactical crisis. Within weeks of the battle, the Senate convened special military tribunals not to assign blame but to gather testimony. Every centurion who survived was questioned. Every soldier who faced Celtic longswords and lived was asked to describe exactly what happened, what worked, what failed, and why. This systematic collection of battlefield intelligence was revolutionary for ancient warfare. Most ancient armies learned through tradition and the personal experience of commanders. Rome was attempting something different, creating an institutional memory of tactical lessons that could be disseminated throughout the legions. The testimony collected after Telamon filled dozens of wax tablets, creating what might be considered the first systematic after-action reports in military history. Tribune Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who would later become one of Rome's greatest generals, was present at these hearings as a young officer. His later writings preserved fragments of soldier testimony that revealed the visceral reality of facing longswords. One soldier, a Hastatus named Gaius Fabricius, described his first moment of combat. The Gaul raised his sword with both hands. I thought he was simply threatening, trying to frighten us. Then he brought it down, and the man beside me, Publius from the third maniple, simply fell in 2 pieces. The sword had cut through his shoulder, through his ribs, and out through his side. I saw his insides before he fell. That was when I understood these were not men. These were demons with demon weapons. Another soldier, veteran of previous campaigns against Samnites and Etruscans, testified that everything he knew about sword fighting was useless against Celtic longswords. You learn to watch the point, he explained. A sword is dangerous where it points. But these swords, the entire length was death. The point, the edge, even the flat could crush your skull if swung hard enough. You couldn't watch one part. You had to watch the whole weapon, and the whole weapon was longer than you could reach. The testimony revealed patterns that Roman military theorists could analyze. Celtic warriors, when fighting in formation, typically delivered overhead strikes in the first exchange, trying to split shields or crush helmets. If this failed, they would shift to horizontal slashes aimed at the neck or torso, trying to get around or under Roman shields. Only in close quarters would they attempt thrusting attacks, and even then their swords were designed primarily for cutting. Roman soldiers reported that Celtic warriors showed clear preferences in targeting. Younger, less experienced Gauls tended to attack shields, trying to destroy Roman defences. Veterans aimed for exposed body parts, the sword arm, the legs below the shield, the head, if a soldier raised his eyes above his shield rim. The most skilled warriors could deliver diagonal strikes that came around shields from unexpected angles, exploiting the brief moments when Romans adjusted their defensive positions. The weight and momentum of longsword attacks created problems Roman shields weren't designed to handle. A standard scutum could reliably stop gladius thrusts and light slashing attacks. But a longsword strike delivered with full body rotation, and both arms generated kinetic energy that simply transferred through the shield into the bearer's body. Soldiers reported broken arms even when shields successfully blocked attacks. The force of repeated strikes could literally beat down a soldier's guard through sheer accumulated trauma. Roman military physicians treating Telamon casualties documented injuries unlike anything in their experience. The standard Roman military medical texts, based on Greek works by Hippocrates and later physicians, described treating puncture wounds, broken bones from falls or blunt impacts, and burns. Celtic longsword wounds didn't fit these categories. These were massive traumatic injuries that combined deep cutting with crushing force. Physician Gaius Antonius, serving with the legions at Telamon, wrote a now-lost treatise on treating barbaric weapon injuries. Fragments preserved by later medical writers describe his techniques for dealing with limb severance, skull fractures from edged weapons, and the particular problem of wounds that cut deeply through multiple tissue layers simultaneously. His success rate was limited by ancient medical knowledge, but his documentation influenced Roman military medicine for generations. The psychological casualties from Telamon proved as significant as physical injuries. Roman military culture expected soldiers to face death with stoic courage. But there was a difference between facing death from weapons you understood and facing death from weapons that seemed to make all your training irrelevant. Multiple soldiers reported complete paralysis in the first moments of combat, unable to move or respond as they watched Celtic longswords descend. Centurion Lucius Cornelius, commanding the 6th century of the second cohort, reported that discipline collapsed in several maniples during initial contact. Men threw down shields and ran, not from cowardice but from overwhelming sensory shock. The sound of longswords cutting through air, the sight of comrades literally dismembered, the vibration through shields from blocked strikes, all combined to produce what Cornelius described as madness that spreads like plague through ranks. The Roman response to these psychological casualties was characteristically practical and brutal. Men who broke and ran were subject to decimation, the execution of every 10th man selected by lot. But the Roman command also recognized that simply punishing fear didn't address its cause. Soldiers needed tools and techniques to master their terror, not just punishment for failing to do so. The training reforms implemented after Telamon included specific psychological conditioning. Recruits were exposed gradually to the sight and sound of longsword-style weapons. Training dummies were fitted with pig carcasses so soldiers could see what slashing weapons did to flesh. The sound of wooden training longswords cutting through air became a constant presence in training camps. Desensitization, though Romans lacked the term, was systematically applied. More sophisticated was the Roman approach to building confidence through technical competence. Soldiers were taught specific responses to specific longsword attacks: overhead strike, step forward and thrust at the extended arms; horizontal slash, duck below and thrust at the torso. By creating a catalogue of responses, Romans gave their soldiers agency. They weren't helpless victims of unstoppable weapons. They were trained fighters with techniques for every situation. The equipment modifications mandated after Telamon went beyond simple armour improvements. Roman military authorities studied the geometry of combat, the actual distances and angles at which soldiers met enemies. They realised that the Roman battle line, with soldiers standing about 3 feet apart, created gaps that Celtic warriors could exploit with their reach advantage. The solution was to tighten formations even further, reducing gaps to less than 2 feet, making it physically impossible for longswords to be swung effectively against the Roman line. This tighter spacing required modifications to Roman shields. The scutum was already curved to wrap partially around the soldier's body, but post-Telamon designs increased this curvature and added overlapping zones where adjacent shields could be locked together. The result was a more continuous defensive barrier that presented fewer gaps for enemy weapons to penetrate. The gladius itself underwent subtle modifications in response to Celtic weapons. While the basic design remained unchanged, too fundamental to Roman tactics to alter radically, the blade was reinforced to handle the stress of deflecting, rather than just blocking enemy attacks. The crossguard was enlarged to provide better hand protection when swords met swords. The pommel was weighted to improve balance, making it easier to maneuver the weapon in the tight quarters where Romans now fought preferentially. Roman javelin tactics also evolved in response to longsword-armed enemies. The pilum, Rome's heavy javelin, had always been intended to disrupt enemy formations before close combat. But against Celtic warriors, the pilum took on additional importance as a tool for destroying enemy weapons. A pilum that struck a Celtic shield would bend, making the shield unwieldy. But a pilum that struck a Celtic longsword could damage or bend the blade, reducing its effectiveness in subsequent close combat. Roman soldiers were trained to target enemy weapons deliberately with pilum throws. This wasn't easy. A sword blade presented a small target and Celtic warriors actively defended their primary weapons. But even a small percentage of successful weapon strikes could significantly reduce the threat posed by Celtic charges. A warband of 1,000 Celtic warriors with 100 damaged or destroyed longswords was measurably less dangerous than a warband with all weapons intact. The tactical evolution of Roman formations after Telamon reflected deep understanding of how longswords actually worked in combat. Roman commanders realised that Celtic weapons were optimised for the first clash, the initial violent contact between battle lines. If Romans could survive or avoid this initial exchange, Celtic advantages diminished. The response was to develop a fighting retreat tactic specifically for use against Celtic armies. This tactic, recorded in military manuals produced decades after Telamon, involved Roman lines deliberately giving ground during initial contact while maintaining formation integrity. Celtic warriors, expecting Roman lines to stand and receive their charges, found themselves pursuing an enemy that retreated just fast enough to prevent decisive engagement. This pursuit disrupted Celtic formations, separated warriors from their comrades, and exhausted them physically as they swung their heavy weapons repeatedly without landing decisive blows. Once Celtic formations were disrupted and warriors were winded from pursuit and repeated weapon strikes, Roman formations would halt, reform with fresh troops in the front ranks, and counterattack. Now, the battle was fought on Roman terms, close-quarters combat in tight formations where gladi were superior. This tactical doctrine, a fighting retreat followed by aggressive counterattack, became standard Roman practice against Celtic opponents. The logistics of implementing these tactical and equipment changes across Rome's entire military establishment was staggering. Rome fielded dozens of legions plus allied forces. Each legion required thousands of pieces of modified equipment, helmets, shields, armour, weapons. The economic strain of this rapid military modernisation was substantial, requiring emergency military appropriations and new taxes. But Rome's political system, for all its internal conflicts and factional struggles, proved capable of remarkable efficiency when faced with existential threats. The Senate authorised whatever funds were necessary. Workshops throughout Italy were converted to military production. Skilled craftsmen were drafted or contracted to produce military equipment. Within 5 years of Telamon, the majority of Rome's military forces had been re-equipped with improved armour and retrained in new tactics. The speed and scale of this transformation revealed advantages Rome possessed that Celtic tribes could never match. Rome had a sophisticated political system capable of mobilizing entire society for war. Rome had an industrial base, primitive by modern standards, but advanced for antiquity, capable of mass-producing complex military equipment. Rome had institutional memory and systematic training that ensured lessons learned in one campaign informed all subsequent military operations. Celtic societies, by contrast, remained fundamentally decentralized. Each tribe had its own traditions, its own preferred weapons and tactics. A lesson learned by one Celtic warband rarely spread to others. Celtic metalworking remained primarily an individual craft, master smiths producing weapons one at a time. There was no Celtic equivalent to Roman military schools, no systematic training for warriors, no institutional analysis of what worked and what failed in battle. This difference in military culture would prove as decisive as any individual weapon or tactic. Rome could evolve faster than its enemies because Rome treated warfare as a science requiring study and innovation. Celtic warfare remained an art form, highly developed within traditional parameters, but resistant to systematic change. The generational transfer of knowledge about fighting Celtic longswords became embedded in Roman military culture. Veterans of Telamon who survived went on to train the next generation of soldiers. Their first-hand knowledge of what worked and what failed was passed directly to recruits. This created an ever-expanding pool of experience that made Rome progressively more effective against Celtic opponents with each passing decade. By contrast, Celtic warrior culture, while it passed down martial skills from generation to generation, didn't accumulate systematic knowledge of Roman tactics. Each Celtic warrior learned traditional techniques from elders, but there was no institutional mechanism for studying Roman methods and developing counters. Celtic tribes that fought Rome learned individual lessons, but those lessons often died with the warriors who learned them. The social organization of Celtic society actually hindered military evolution. Celtic warriors were primarily aristocrats who fought for personal glory and tribal reputation. Warfare was as much about demonstrating individual prowess as achieving military objectives. A Celtic warrior who adopted unheroic but effective tactics, such as refusing single combat or employing deception, might win battles but lose social status. Roman soldiers faced no such constraints. Victory was what mattered, not the method of achieving it. This cultural difference manifested in how both societies treated military innovation. Rome celebrated generals who won battles through clever tactics or new equipment. Celtic societies celebrated warriors who won glory through traditional displays of courage. When a Roman general developed a new formation or tactic that proved effective, it was analysed, refined, and disseminated throughout the legions. When a Celtic warrior developed new techniques, they remained personal skills rarely shared or systematised. The economic structures underlying military capability also favoured Rome dramatically. Celtic warfare was fundamentally aristocratic. The finest weapons and armour were available only to tribal elites who could afford the services of master smiths. Common Celtic warriors often fought with simple weapons and minimal protection. This created a military force with a core of highly effective elite warriors surrounded by much less capable levies. Roman military organisation was different. Rome equipped all its citizen soldiers, regardless of personal wealth, with standardised military gear. The quality might vary based on assignment and legion status, but even the poorest Roman soldier received shield, helmet, and sword. This democratisation of military equipment created larger numbers of effective soldiers than Celtic systems could produce. The metallurgical legacy of Celtic longswords extended far beyond the immediate military threat they posed. Roman smiths studying captured Celtic weapons learned techniques they had not independently developed. The pattern welding process, where different grades of iron were combined to create blades with optimal combinations of hardness and flexibility, was a Celtic innovation that would eventually influence Roman metalworking broadly. But Rome characteristically didn't simply copy Celtic methods. Roman smiths adapted pattern welding techniques to mass production requirements. Where Celtic smiths produced individual masterwork blades, Roman smiths developed simplified versions of pattern welding that could be executed more quickly and consistently. The result was weapons that might not match the finest Celtic swords in quality, but were produced in vastly greater quantities. This approach, sacrificing ultimate quality for producibility, reflected a fundamentally Roman military philosophy. Rome didn't need every soldier to have the finest possible equipment. Rome needed every soldier to have good enough equipment and enough soldiers to overwhelm any opponent. Quantity had a quality all its own, a principle Rome understood intuitively. The cultural memory of Telamon persisted in Roman society, long after the immediate military threat had passed. Roman art and literature returned repeatedly to themes of Roman discipline triumphing over barbarian ferocity. Sculptural reliefs showing Roman soldiers in combat with Celtic warriors emphasized the contrast between orderly Roman formations and chaotic Celtic mobs, between controlled Roman thrusting and wild Celtic slashing. This cultural narrative, while serving propaganda purposes, contained genuine historical truth. Roman victory against Celtic longswords did come from discipline, organisation, and systematic adaptation, but Roman art rarely showed the cost of that victory, the thousands of Roman soldiers who died learning how to fight against unfamiliar weapons, the casualties absorbed before effective tactics were developed. The monuments erected after Telamon told only the triumphant version of events. The victory monument at Telamon itself showed defeated Gauls and triumphant Romans without depicting the actual terror of the battle. Later monuments commemorating subsequent victories over Celtic tribes followed the same pattern. Roman viewers seeing these monuments would understand that Rome had defeated dangerous enemies, but they wouldn't see the desperate fighting, the horrific casualties, or the tactical crises that preceded victory. This selective memory served Rome's political needs, but obscured genuine lessons about military adaptation and the cost of learning. Future Roman commanders facing unfamiliar enemies would sometimes underestimate the challenge precisely because Roman cultural memory emphasized inevitable triumph, rather than the difficult process of achieving it. The linguistic legacy of Telamon appeared in Latin military terminology. New words entered the military lexicon to describe Celtic weapons and the tactics needed to counter them. Gladius longus for the longsword itself, impetus gallicus for the devastating Celtic charge, formatio condensata for the tight Roman formations developed to counter Celtic reach advantages. These terms, preserved in military manuals and historical texts, ensured that lessons from Telamon would be remembered and transmitted. Roman military literature that emerged in the decades after Telamon showed clear influence from the battle's lessons. Writers like Cato the Elder, who served in military campaigns against Celtic tribes in the 190s BCE, emphasized the importance of discipline and formation integrity when facing barbarian enemies. His now mostly lost work on military matters reportedly contained extensive sections on fighting Celtic warriors, drawing on the accumulated experience of multiple Roman-Celtic conflicts. The philosophical impact of Telamon on Roman military thinking was subtle but profound. Before Telamon, Roman military confidence came from a belief in natural superiority. Roman discipline, organisation and civic virtue made Roman arms invincible. After Telamon, Roman confidence was based on something different: systematic learning and continuous adaptation. Rome would prevail not because Romans were naturally superior, but because Roman systems were better at identifying and solving military problems. This shift from cultural supremacy to systematic superiority might seem subtle, but it had major implications. Cultural supremacy is brittle. A single defeat can shatter it. Systematic superiority is resilient. Defeats are learning opportunities rather than catastrophes. Telamon could have broken Roman military confidence. Instead, because Rome responded systematically rather than emotionally, the defeat became a foundation for future success. The specific tactical lessons from Telamon would remain relevant throughout Rome's conflicts with Celtic peoples. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, over 150 years later, employed tactics directly descended from post-Telamon innovations. Caesar's soldiers fought in tight formations, used shields to deflect slashing attacks while closing distance, and targeted enemy weapons with missile fire before close combat. The tactical doctrine that Caesar's legions executed with such effectiveness at Alesia and elsewhere originated in the desperate fighting at Telamon. But perhaps the most important long-term impact of Telamon was the precedent it established for Roman military flexibility. Rome learned that no weapon system, no tactical doctrine, no training regimen was perfect or permanent. Enemies would always present new challenges. The army that could adapt fastest would prevail. This philosophy of continuous evolution would serve Rome well against diverse opponents across 3 continents over 5 centuries. The Celtic longsword at Telamon represented the high watermark of Celtic military technology. These weapons, developed over centuries of intertribal warfare and refined by master craftsmen, were genuinely superior to Roman weapons for specific types of combat. Celtic warriors who wielded them were trained from childhood in their use. The shock Roman soldiers experienced wasn't irrational fear of the unknown. it was rational fear of genuinely dangerous enemies with genuinely superior weapons in open combat. But weapons alone don't win wars. Societies win wars. Rome's society, with its capacity for systematic organization, rapid adaptation, and mass mobilization, proved superior to Celtic tribal societies despite Celtic advantages in individual weapon quality and warrior skill. The longsword that shocked Roman soldiers at Telamon became the catalyst for military reforms that made Rome progressively more difficult to defeat. By the time of Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Roman soldiers no longer feared Celtic longswords. They respected them, certainly. They trained specifically to counter them. But the terror that had gripped Roman lines at Telamon had been replaced by professional confidence built on generations of experience and institutional knowledge. The weapon that had nearly broken Roman armies became just another challenge that Roman systems had learned to overcome. The archaeological evidence from late Celtic Roman conflicts shows this evolution clearly. Battle sites from the 3rd century BCE show high percentages of Roman casualties from slashing weapons. Sites from the 1st century BCE show dramatically different patterns, with Roman casualties concentrated among troops caught out of formation or surprised. In stand-up battles between disciplined Roman legions and Celtic warbands, the casualty ratios had reversed completely. This reversal wasn't because Roman weapons had improved dramatically. The gladius of Caesar's time was essentially identical to the gladius at Telamon. Roman victory came from 2 centuries of accumulated tactical knowledge about fighting Celtic warriors, knowledge purchased at terrible cost in battles like Telamon but preserved, refined, and transmitted through Roman military institutions. The story of Roman soldiers' first encounter with Celtic longswords at Telamon is ultimately a story about how societies learn from trauma. Rome could have responded to Telamon with panic, with blame, with desperate defensive measures. Instead, Rome responded with systematic analysis, measured adaptation, and institutional learning. The shock of Celtic longswords was transformed into the foundation of Roman tactical supremacy. Celtic warriors would continue wielding longswords for centuries, but never again would they enjoy the advantages they possessed at Telamon, the advantage of complete surprise, of facing an enemy with no knowledge of how to counter their weapons, of tactical superiority at the moment of contact. Rome learned, adapted, and never forgot. The terror that Celtic longswords inflicted at Telamon was real and devastating. But Rome's response to that terror ensured it would never be repeated.